Hey everybody, it's Mr. White here with your final set of notes about supply and demand. So if you have not watched the other videos, especially the ones about equilibrium, go back and watch those before you watch this video. It'll make all of this make a lot more sense. Okay, so in those previous videos, we talked about the fictional market for candy bars in your class. And let's say that you and the other classmates who have gotten into this market, you all sit down today and you decide, you know what? Let's work together. Let's set our price of candy bars where we decide, not where the market decides. Let's increase the market price of candy bars to $2 each, and if we all do it, then everybody will have to pay, right? Well, you know, should you do this? Why or why not? I mean, I'm sure there may be some moral reasons, but let's just think strictly from a business standpoint. How will increasing the price of candy influence market demand for candy? You should probably know this already if you've watched the previous videos, but are there any advantages to charging a higher price? I mean, if you guys come up with this agreement and you all charge $2, what's going to happen? Are you going to make more money? Are you going to make less money? This is a very difficult decision. I want you to think about this as we go through these notes because as we discuss elasticity of supply and demand, I think you'll discover the answer. So that brings us to the question of what is elasticity? Elasticity simply means flexibility, right? If you talk about something being elastic, you're saying it's flexible. And if we say that something is inelastic, we mean it's not flexible. So like rubber bands are elastic. You can stretch them. They change shape when you apply force. Whereas an expo marker, while it might be able to bend slightly, especially if you're pretty strong, I'm sure you could bend an expo marker. Please don't start breaking expo markers. But you might be able to get it to bend a little bit, but it's not meant to bend. It's not flexible, okay? So you might be saying, well, what does that have to do with supply and demand? Well, when we talk about the elasticity of supply and demand, what we're talking about is the degree of flexibility of producers and consumers to respond to a change in the market price for a good or a service. So elasticity of supply and demand means flexibility. How flexible are we if there's a change in the market price? In other words, if the price changes, are we going to stop buying it or are we going to go right on buying it anyways? Now, we're going to get into a little bit of math. Don't be scared. If you're not a math person, this is really just division. I'll do all the complicated stuff. I won't make you do any of the complicated math, but it'll help you better understand what elasticity really means and sort of the implications of it, especially if you're a math person. So elasticity is just defined as the percent change in quantity over the percent change in price. So we can apply this to supply or demand. We could say the percent change in quantity demanded divided by the percent change in price. This basically just tells us how responsive are consumers to a change in the price. That's if we're talking about the elasticity of demand, or how responsive are producers to a change in the price, okay? If the absolute value of elasticity is greater than or equal to 1, then we say that that product has elastic demand or elastic supply, okay? That means that a change in the price causes a proportionally greater change in quantity supplied or quantity demanded. So in other words, if the price goes up like 1%, then we're going to see the quantity supplied or the quantity demanded change by 3% or something like that, okay? Now, if the absolute value of elasticity is less than 1, the product's inelastic. That means quantity supplied or quantity demanded is not sensitive to price. So a change in price causes a proportionally smaller change to quantity supplied or quantity demanded. So, if you're interested, mathematically, this is the same as the slope for our supply or demand function. So it's like the mx part of that y equals mx plus b. So elastic demand just means that consumers can respond to a change in the price by changing their quantity demanded, okay? In other words, if this thing gets more expensive, I'm just going to buy less of it. Now, the demand curve for these kind of products will appear to be at a 45-degree angle or less. So they're going to look really flat, like almost a horizontal curve all the way to a completely horizontal curve. And essentially, it just means that a 1% change in price will result in more than a 1% change in quantity demanded, i.e., the consumers can be flexible if the price changes. I mean, this is really the key intuition. So if all this math stuff is making your head spin, just write down this highlighted yellow part. Okay, now elastic supply means that producers can respond to a change in price by changing their quantity supplied. So the supply curve will appear to be at a 45-degree angle or less. So once again, it's a flatter looking curve. I mean, that's really another thing I'll highlight that here. The curve is flatter if it's elastic. The more elastic it is, the flatter it's going to look. And that just means that a 1% change in price would result in more than a 1% change in quantity supplied. So the key intuition here, guys, the producers can be flexible if the price changes. So what kind of characteristics would we expect to see in a product that has elastic demand? Well, there's three main things, and this is what you can use to sort of like already guess if something has elastic supply or demand. First of all, substitutes are available. Second of all, it's a want, not a need. And lastly, it's usually but not always expensive. So something like foreign travel is going to tend to have pretty elastic demand. Now, characteristics of a product with elastic supply are that, first of all, they can be produced really quickly. Second of all, they can be produced with unskilled labor. And last of all, they're made from abundant resources. They're not anything that's super duper rare. So like fast food usually has pretty elastic supply. So let's look at elastic demand and elastic supply on a graph. Over here on the left, I've got a graph that shows elastic demand, where the price elasticity of demand is greater than 1. And this would maybe represent the demand for tickets to a foreign country. Perhaps the tickets used to cost $400, but then the price went up to $500. That represents a 25% increase in the price. Let's go ahead and write that, 25%. Now, down here, when that happens, there were 100 people maybe per year that used to buy that plane ticket, but now only 40 people per year are going to buy that plane ticket. And so that represents negative 60%. Okay, so if we just go ahead and do the math on this one here, remember we said it's quantity, the change in quantity divided by the change in price. That would be 0.6 divided by 0.25. Okay, I'll let you go ahead and work that out. If you need to, pause the video. All right. Now, since this 6 was actually negative, you should have got, and if you didn't, it's okay, negative 2.4. Because remember, what we really care about here is the absolute value. So negative 2.4, the absolute value would just be 2.4, okay? And so what that tells us here is that the price elasticity of demand is negative 2.4 or 2.4 in absolute value terms. And so therefore we have elastic demand. It means consumers are pretty flexible about buying this plane ticket. Now for the Subway sandwich, we have a similar kind of situation, a little bit different numbers here though, okay? So this time the price went up from $4 to $5. Okay, once again, that represents a 25% increase in the price. Okay, and as a result, the quantity supplied went from 40 up to 100. That actually represents a 100 and, excuse me, not 125. This is a 150% increase. Okay, so what we would want to do here is we would say 1.5 divided by 0.25, okay? And this time it's positive. I'll let you go ahead and work that out. That equals 6, okay? And so in this case, 6 is certainly a lot bigger than 1 in real terms and in absolute value terms, okay? So our price elasticity of supply is equal to 6. This is elastic. It tells us that Subway can be pretty flexible about creating more sandwiches if the price goes up by even $1. Now, when it comes to inelastic demand and inelastic supply, you got the opposite going on. Consumers cannot easily change their quantity demanded when the price changes. The demand curve in this case is going to appear to be at greater than a 45-degree angle. It's going to be a very steep looking curve. And so that's one really important thing you got to remember here, steep. Okay, they cannot change their quantity demanded. So 1% change in price causes less than a 1% change in quantity demanded. Pay attention to the intuition. Consumers are not flexible, even if the price changes a lot. Okay. With inelastic supply, same thing, but now we're talking about for producers. Producers cannot easily change their quantity supplied, even when the price changes. So in this case, the supply curve is going to be very steep. It's going to be greater than a 45-degree angle. So producers aren't flexible, even if the price changes a lot. So once again, we got three characteristics. The three characteristics of inelastic demand is that there's no substitute available. Also, it's a need, not a want. It's something you have to have it. And usually, but not always, it's inexpensive. So a great example here could be like insulin, especially if you're a diabetic person. When it comes to inelastic supply, once again, we have three characteristics. First of all, it cannot be produced quickly. Second of all, it requires skilled labor. You can't just grab anybody off the street to produce this thing. And last of all, it's usually made from precious or at least very rare resources. Think like diamond rings, for example. Okay, so let's look at those two examples on a graph. If the price of insulin went from $100 per vial to $250 per vial, perhaps the quantity demanded would go from 10 million down to 6 million. Basically, insulin is a need, not a want. So even if the price goes up, we're still going to see people buying insulin. Maybe they'll buy a little bit less of it, but they're still going to buy the insulin. So the price change here would be a 150% price change, and the quantity change here is a negative 40% quantity change. So what we would do here is we'd say negative 0.4 divided by 1.5. I'll let you go ahead and work that out. You can pause the video. That gives us negative 0.27. And since the absolute value of negative 0.27 is just 0.27, that is less than 1. And negative 0.27 is also less than 1, but negative 0.27 means that we have inelastic demand for insulin. Okay. Now over here, let's say a 1-carat diamond engagement ring used to cost $1,000, but now the price has gone up to $2,000. That actually represents a 100% increase in the price. The price has doubled. Suppose as a result, the jewelry stores in town, they used to have 6,000 of these rings for sale. Now they have 10,000 of these rings for sale. That represents a 67% increase in quantity supplied. So once again, what we're going to do here is we're going to say 0.67 divided by 1, and that gives us 0.67. Okay, so absolute value of 0.67 is just 0.67. So once again, this is less than 1. So our price elasticity of supply is 0.67. It's inelastic. Now there are some special cases with elasticity. We don't see these very much, but in a way they're good to study just because they give us some idea of what the extreme looks like. So perfectly inelastic demand or perfectly inelastic supply is where the curve is completely vertical. It could be a completely vertical demand or supply curve. This indicates that the price of the good or the service has zero impact on quantity. So the price elasticity of demand or the price elasticity of supply is equal to 0. Like for example, beachfront property. Guys, it doesn't matter if you charge like a really low price or a really high price for property that's on the beach. There's only a certain limited quantity of property that's on the beach. And so whether the price is high or low, that quantity never changes. It's set by nature, I guess you could say. Now, perfectly elastic demand or supply looks like a completely horizontal demand curve or a completely horizontal supply curve. If we're talking about perfectly elastic demand, we're saying that consumers will buy any quantity at one price or below, but 0 above that price. If we're talking about supply, it means that producers would produce any quantity at one price or above, but 0 quantity below that price. So the price elasticity of demand or price elasticity of supply is infinite. So for example, like bananas. When you go in the grocery store, your price elasticity of demand for bananas is set at the market price. So if the market price is like 25 cents per pound, then that means that you would buy any amount of bananas that you want at that price or below that price. Like if the price was 15 cents per pound, hey, you know what? You would buy that. But if you saw a banana that for some reason was being sold for 30 cents, you're not going to buy that banana because there's bananas for sale for 25 cents per pound. So we see this a lot, especially if we're talking about individual demand. We don't see it so much from market demand. All right, so now that we've talked about elasticity, let's real quick test your knowledge of some different products. Think about those different characteristics, and let's say whether the demand for these products is elastic or inelastic. If you need to, you can pause the video. All right, so electricity, is the demand elastic or inelastic? It's inelastic, yeah. Electricity is a need, not a want. And honestly, there's not really a substitute for electricity in your house. What about tobacco? Yeah, tobacco is inelastic. So it's inelastic because people are addicted to it, and there's not really a good substitute for tobacco. I mean, I guess you could say e-cigs, but that's made from tobacco. What about red box rentals? Yep, that's elastic. The thing about Redbox Rentals is there are substitutes available. You could watch Netflix or I don't know, maybe you could just watch a video on YouTube or something. You don't have to watch a Redbox video. What about printed newspapers? Yep, that's elastic. The reason why is because we can get news from other sources. We can't say that all of them are great sources, but people get news in other ways. So if the price of a newspaper goes up, we're not going to buy newspapers anymore. And last but not least, gasoline. It's inelastic. See, the thing about gasoline is if you drive a gas-powered car, you don't have any substitutes that you can put in your tank, and it's not a want, it's definitely a need. So gasoline is inelastic. Let's try another couple of examples. Now this time we're talking about supply. Is the supply elastic or inelastic? If you need to, pause the video. Okay, for clothing, clothing has elastic supply. Clothing is relatively easy to create. It doesn't take a lot of skill to create it, maybe to design it, but not to actually sew it together. And it can be done relatively quickly. What about satellites? Well, satellites are inelastic in their supply. I mean, you literally have to be a rocket scientist to build one of these things, so it takes quite a lot of skill and a lot of time. What about plastic toys? Yep, you guessed it, elastic supply. The resources are plentiful, and it doesn't take a lot of skill to make plastic toys in a factory. Luxury watches, think like Rolexes. Inelastic supply. Oh, you're getting good at this. Okay, Rolexes have inelastic supply because they're handmade and they're made from precious metals like gold and they have things like diamonds in them. So they're pretty expensive for a reason and they cannot be produced very quickly. Last of all, landscaping services. That means like mowing your yard. Yep, that's elastic. Pretty much anybody with a lawnmower can do that. Maybe not well, but it's not something that is hard to replicate or takes quite a lot of skill to pull off. All right, back to business. So let's get back to that question about you and your classmates, okay? If you guys are trying to decide how much to charge for your chocolate, it helps to know the elasticity of demand for chocolate bars. Then you can determine how a price change would impact your total revenue. So two things we need to know about. One thing is called the price effect. The price effect says that after a price increase, each unit sold sells at a higher price, which tends to raise our revenue, makes our money that we collect go up. But then there's also a quantity effect. After a price increase, fewer units of that product are going to be sold, which tends to lower the revenue. So we got to find a balance here, and it all has to do with elasticity. Now, total revenue, you may remember we talked about this in previous lectures, is price times quantity sold. So if the demand for a good is inelastic, meaning that the price elasticity of demand is less than 1, an increase in price increases total revenue. So the quantity effect is less than the price effect. Essentially what we're saying here is that if people don't have a lot of choice about buying your product, you can raise the price and actually make more money because you're not going to lose that many customers. Now, if demand for a good is elastic, meaning that the price elasticity of demand is greater than 1, then an increase in price will decrease your total revenue because the quantity effect is going to outweigh the price effect. What I mean here is that you're going to lose too many customers so that even though you're charging a higher price for your product, not very many people are going to buy it and you're going to actually make less money. And if your demand is something called unit elastic, which means that the price elasticity of demand is equal to exactly 1, then an increase in the price doesn't change your total revenue. So you could raise the price or lower the price of your candy bars and you'll make the same amount of money no matter what. So what do you think? For selling candy bars in class, do you think the demand is elastic or inelastic? What do you think? I think it's probably elastic. So that means that if you guys raise the price of your chocolate bars, what's going to happen? It's going to decrease your total revenue. You'll actually make less money. So probably you should not raise the price of your candy bars. Okay, the last thing we'll talk about here is the implication of elasticity for policymakers, meaning like people in the government. And the thing is, guys, government charges taxes on businesses. And one type of tax you should know about is called an excise tax. It's a tax on the production of a good or a service. Like, for example, a tax on gasoline. If you didn't know it, there's actually a tax on every gallon of gas you buy. If you've never noticed this before, next time you go fill up your car, look at this sticker that says Howdy Neighbors. And it actually says what the tax is right down here at the bottom. So that can be your homework assignment. Go look for that. Okay. So when government is considering taxing a good or a service, they need to consider the tax incidence. In other words, who's going to bear the burden of this tax? Is this tax going to hurt consumers or is it going to hurt producers? Because it's going to hurt one of them. We can actually predict the tax incidence based on the relative elasticities of supply and demand in a market, meaning which one is more inelastic. Whichever is more inelastic, either supply or demand, means that that person or that group will bear the burden of the tax in the market. So if the supply is more inelastic than the demand, that means the producers are going to pay that tax. If the demand is more inelastic than the supply, then the consumers will pay that tax. And the reason why this is critical is because most of the time when government decides to increase taxes on something, it's because they want to, I guess you could say punish one group in society. So for example, government might raise taxes on oil companies because they want to punish oil companies for polluting the environment. But we have to consider whether or not the elasticity of demand and the elasticity of supply for oil are elastic or inelastic to know who that's going to hurt. It actually turns out that oil companies have elastic supply, but we all have inelastic demand for oil. So when we tax oil companies, who's it going to hurt? It's going to hurt consumers, actually, because the consumers are more inelastic, and therefore the consumers will bear the burden of that tax. All right, guys, here's our summary. You made it to the end. Elasticity is just the percent change in quantity divided by the percent change in price. This tells us how sensitive supply and demand are to changes in the price. If something's elastic, that means the price elasticity of demand or the price elasticity of supply has an absolute value that's greater than or equal to 1. So the quantity changes more than the price, or at least as much as the price, meaning that we're flexible when the price changes. Inelastic means that the price elasticity of demand or supply has an absolute value that's less than 1. So price changes more than quantity. Basically, we're not flexible. The effects on total revenue are unmistakable when we think about elasticity. If demand is inelastic, you can raise the price of your product and your total revenue doesn't go down. You might actually make more money. If demand is elastic, however, you can't raise the price of your product without losing money. There are also effects when it comes to government, so the effects of tax incidence. If the supply is more inelastic, the producers will bear the burden of the tax. But if the demand is more inelastic, then that means the consumers will bear the burden of the tax because the consumers are not as flexible when it comes to buying that product. All right, guys, that's it for our elasticity of supply and demand lecture. If you have questions about this, please let me know. Thanks for watching. See you next time.